For many, the unknown can be the scariest thing, whether that's the unknown fate of a loved one or the unknown cause of some terrible event. When answers are unknown, it not only makes it harder to move forward from a terrible event, but it also makes it harder to prevent in the future. That's why mysteries, even those that could have relatively simple answers, are scary in their own right. Number 5. Carl Erik Björkegren was once one of the richest men in Sweden. He amassed a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars during the 1980s, with a focus on real estate and art collection. But by the time he disappeared in 1994, he had an enormous debt which he would never repay. Carl had started his career as an accountant at an engineering company called Sandvik AB in the 1950s. Over the next 3 decades or so, he gradually rose through the ranks to become the first deputy managing director. At the same time, he was purchasing stocks and investments. Some of those stocks were in the same company he was deputy managing director of. In 1982, he became the first person convicted in Sweden for insider trading. That didn't seem to cause too many problems for Carl, who continued to amass wealth. At the height of his real estate empire, he was worth 2.5 billion kroner, the equivalent of about 700 million US dollars. He liked to show off, hosting parties and becoming known for being a bit eccentric. But not everything was as it seemed for Carl. Most of his wealth was tied up in real estate, and he had taken out many high-risk loans to pay for the buildings. It would have been a solid investment, but in 1991, the housing bubble burst. The art market also took a hit. Before, Carl had art worth roughly 500 million kroner, but this wouldn't be much help in paying off his debts. Carl declared bankruptcy, and it should have been devastating. Carl had always liked to live a life of luxury, and now even the pension he took from Sandvik was handed over every month to the authorities. But Carl continued to live well. This was due to 2 reasons. The first was that some of his assets were transferred over to his daughters before he filed for bankruptcy. That included his luxury beachfront villa in the town of Viken, as well as some pieces of art. The second wouldn't be revealed until after his mysterious disappearance. Carl had a secret Swiss bank account where he had managed to store billions of kroner. It was a numbered account, which meant there was no name attached to it. It was also hidden from the authorities. Every so often, Carl or his butler would go to Switzerland to take out cash which Carl would then use to fund his lavish lifestyle. The secret money was good, but it also had a downside. For example, when Carl discovered that his butler had been stealing from the leather briefcase where he hid the cash, he couldn't go to the police about the theft. Carl had to simply let the butler go and hire a new one. But in general, things appeared to be going well until 1994. Carl's relationship with his 4th wife had broken down. On June 2nd, he was preparing to fly to Stockholm to finalize the divorce. The plan had been to meet his lawyer and one of his daughters in a pre-booked room at the extravagant Grand Hotel. That morning, his butler arrived for work. It was an overcast day, but he planned to mow the lawn and had hired a mower. Carl was all packed and had laid out his overcoat, ready for the trip that afternoon. The butler informed him that he wouldn't be available between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., as he needed to watch his daughter while his wife went to a hair appointment. It was no problem to Carl, as the flight wasn't until later in the day. The 2 men went about their morning activities like normal. The butler mowed the lawn, left to look after his daughter, and returned around 1. When he came back, Carl was nowhere to be found. The weekend bag that he had packed for the trip and his transport were also missing, but Carl's overcoat was still laid out, untouched. Carl never arrived for his meeting with the lawyer and his daughter, and his family were informed of his disappearance. At first, they believed Carl had voluntarily gone missing, but after they didn't hear from him for 2 weeks, they began to think something more sinister was happening and contacted the authorities. There were some signs of a disturbance at the house. As well as the missing items, there was damage to Carl's safe. As if someone had tried to force their way in. But all of the expensive items that Carl had managed to keep from debt collectors still remained. It obviously wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. For many, suspicion fell on the butler, who doesn't appear to have been named. The butler wasn't only the last person to have ever seen Carl, He was the only person that saw him at all that day. If he was responsible for the disappearance, it was possible Carl had disappeared the night before. It was claimed that he had set up the alibi with his daughter to arrange a window when someone else could have potentially committed the crime. The butler apparently had a history of running scams. Later, he was alleged to have used a stolen Rolex watch and a painting to pay off some of his own debts, but there was never any evidence that this actually occurred. Mysteriously, the butler himself also seems to have disappeared, only adding to the strangeness of this already strange case. Others believe Carl really did disappear voluntarily. His Swiss bank account wasn't touched after his disappearance, but there's a possibility he had a second bank account, or even had simply been hiding cash away. Nobody knows exactly how much he took out from the bank, but never spent. He could easily have stored that to make his great escape. In the years after Carl's disappearance, there were numerous sightings around the world. He was spotted as far away as Oman and Paraguay. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. Carl liked to socialize and show off. Those who were familiar with him found it hard to believe that he would have abandoned that lifestyle, and his friends and family, to live a quiet life with only a fraction of the wealth that he had available. There have been other accusations of foul play. Informants from organized crime groups have claimed that Carl owed money to dangerous people, and that he passed away while they were trying to collect on that money. They didn't intentionally take his life, but had hidden his body after he had a medical emergency or a fall. Another anonymous source claimed that Carl's business partner had taken his life, as that partner was owed money. His body was then balanced on the pontoon of a helicopter before being dropped into the water. No evidence for any of these theories has ever been found. It seemed as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. He left behind a huge amount of debt, some of which was then passed on to family members. Investigators believe the truth of the matter may never be known. If Carl was in debt to criminals, they weren't the sort of people to make deathbed confessions, and many have already passed away themselves. Carl was 73 when he disappeared, and would be 103 if alive today. Number 4. It was off the coast of California that a series of strange flying objects were spotted in the sky in late July of 2019. While this alone would have made for a strange mystery, the incident becomes even scarier considering what was in the ocean beneath these unidentified objects. The incident caught the attention of military personnel and promoted a thorough investigation, but no explanation has been revealed so far. The incidents started on July 14, 2019. There were 6 Navy vessels off the coast of San Diego, near San Clemente Island. This Channel Island is owned by the US Navy and is home to sensitive facilities. The ships themselves were all under normal patrols and weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary as they traveled around the area. Visibility was low, less than 1 nautical mile, though they had radar screens that allowed them to spot things at a further distance. As well as the 6 Navy vessels, there were 3 other ships in the area that night. It wasn't until just before 10 p.m. that anybody recorded anything unusual. It was the USS Kidd that first spotted something out of the ordinary. The logbooks noted that 2 UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles, had been spotted, and the ship's Snooply team had been scrambled. The Snooply team is an onboard intelligence group equipped with cameras. The team is designed to be quick and react better to conditions than the ship's more high-tech cameras. Kidd reported the unidentified crafts to the other Navy ships in the area, and it wasn't long before they were reporting the UAVs, or drones, as well. During one logbook entry from the USS Rafael Peralta, an unidentified object described as a white light was seen hovering over the ship's deck. These ships were not stationary at the time. Hovering over the ship would have required the drone to be traveling at around 16 knots in poor visibility. The sightings continued until about 11:30 p.m. Exactly how many were seen on the first day is hard to determine, but there were at least 2, but likely more. The following night, the incident seemed to repeat itself. The USS Kidd was again the first to spot the craft, reporting the UAV sighting at 9 p.m. but it wasn't long until others in the area were also reporting their own experiences. The swarm of drones seemed to follow the ships for about 3 hours, with dozens reported at once. The military vessels weren't the only ones to see the mysterious craft. A cruise ship named the Carnival Imagination was also in the area. It contacted one of the Navy ships to tell them that it had seen drones and that they hadn't come from the cruise ship. Photographs and video footage were taken throughout the night and would eventually be released to the public. This allegedly shows the drones diving into the water, following the vessels at high speed, and appearing as pyramid-shaped. After the second night of strange activity, the investigation began. The Navy and the FBI were both working on the case, and information was being passed to the commander of the Pacific Fleet and the chief of naval operations. It was clear that this was a serious incident. The civilian ships in the area became a focus of attention. At first, the Algeta was suspected of being responsible, at least for the swarm on the first night. The owner of the vessel was contacted, and he confirmed that there were drones on board and that he had used them that day, but he hadn't been using them during the time period when the drones were spotted. He also claimed he hadn't seen the military vessels and wouldn't have been flying drones at all if he knew they were in the area. The Bass Strait was also suspected of being the origin of the drones. Later reports seemed to assume that the drones did come from this freight vessel, though it's not clear why that assumption was made. The Bass Strait had been in the area on both nights, but the drones appeared long before the ship was in range of the Navy vessels and disappeared after the Bass Strait had reached port. Even during the investigation, the drone attacks continued. Between July 17th and July 30th, there were 4 more reports of unmanned vehicles in the sky. It was assumed that the drones belonged to fishermen or other civilians sailing in the area, but that doesn't quite add up. The drones would need to be much more advanced than anything currently on the market for ordinary people. They were faster than a typical drone and able to sustain that speed for much longer than most drones can operate. Not only that, they did some while being lit up in some cases, which only would have drained the battery life more. They were also a significant distance away from whoever was operating them, unless they were being operated from the ships themselves. If this was a case of civilians harassing Navy ships with drones, they would have to have had access to technology that they probably shouldn't have. They would have had to have been organized as well, as more than a dozen drones were spotted at once. This wasn't just 1 or 2 people playing a joke. If it wasn't civilians, the case is even more worrying. It's possible that the drones had come from the US military. The Fleet Area Control and Surveillance Facility, which operates drones for the military in the area, were contacted during the investigation. They claimed to not have any involvement. There is a possibility that an operation is so top secret that even the people investigating the incident didn't know about it. But given that the statements were being sent straight to the top of the Navy hierarchy, it seems like they would have had the authority to know about anything that could have explained the incident. There's also the possibility that the drones came from another military, or that they weren't drones at all. Someone working on the investigation later told the media that they couldn't be sure it was drones at all. The sailors had used the terms UAVs and drones in their initial reports because that's what the objects looked most like to them. But when the investigation looked closer at images and reports, they couldn't say for certain whether that was accurate or not. What was really flying off the coast of San Diego that June, and why, is still open to speculation. Hopefully one day the truth will be revealed. Number 3. The 3X case is one of the strangest unsolved mysteries. 2 men lost their lives to a sinister criminal claiming to be working for an international secret society. The story resembled something from a spy novel, but the criminal himself was never found, and the crimes faded into obscurity. It started on June 11, 1930 in New York. Joseph Mozinski was a grocer with a wife and 2 children. He seemed like a perfectly ordinary individual, and nobody imagined he had any kind of secret life. There was at least one secret that he was keeping from his wife. For the past 2 years, he'd been having an affair with a young woman named Catherine May. The afternoon when this mystery began, Joseph had asked his wife to look after the shop so he could run errands. He then went with Catherine to a Lover's Lane spot in Queens. They had not long stopped when a man approached the vehicle with a weapon. He ordered Catherine to get into the back seat, then got into the car himself and told Joseph to drive straight ahead into a grove of trees. When Joseph tried to object, the unidentified man fired. So far, the story resembled many of the most disturbing serial killer stories from decades later. But this unidentified man didn't seem concerned at all about Catherine. Instead, he went through Joseph's jacket and Catherine's purse for papers. He either took them for himself or destroyed them. Once he was finished with the papers, he went with Catherine and escorted her to a bus stop. They rode the bus together to College Point. At College Point, he helped Catherine onto a trolley, lifted the black fedora he wore as a way of saying goodbye, and then left. Before going, he'd given Catherine a note and told her not to read it until the next day. The note simply had Joseph's name and a string of letters that seemed to be some kind of code. They were 3X3X097. It meant nothing to Catherine. Whether out of fear or for some other reason, Catherine didn't go to the police. Instead, a passerby noticed Joseph's body the following day and alerted authorities. Authorities found Catherine's coat in the car, and it was only after they tracked her down that she told them what had happened. At first, Catherine's story seemed too strange to believe. It didn't help that she allegedly changed her story multiple times. At one point, she blamed an Italian gangster for the crime, but eventually confessed that that wasn't true. At the same time, a local newspaper received an ominous letter from someone calling themselves 3X. It was the first of many letters sent to the paper. This one claimed credit for the crime, stated that Catherine was innocent, and that 14 of Joseph's friends would also lose their lives. It also hinted at an apparent motive behind the crime, calling Joseph a dirty rat. On June 16th, the second of 3X's victims lost their life. This time, Nick Soley was with a woman named Elizabeth Ring in a parking lot in Queens. Just like the first crime, an unidentified man appeared and told Elizabeth to get into the back seat. He got into the car himself and told Nick to drive forward. Nick protested and the man attacked. This time, he apparently turned the weapon on Elizabeth when she tried to drive forward. In one letter printed not long after the crime, 3X said that Elizabeth started praying. This apparently saved her. 3X said that he couldn't take the life of a woman showing so much courage, and so he let her live. He walked Elizabeth to a car line, helped her board a bus, and then disappeared again. Over the next few days, the paper and the police would get more letters. A letter was also sent to Joseph's brother in Pennsylvania, the only activity from 3X outside of New York. Sometime after June 21st, the police received a long letter which claimed to explain the crimes. 3X claimed to be an agent working for the Red Diamond of Russia, an anti-communist group. He said that he had previously been an officer in the German army before joining the group, which was an international organization. Both Nick Soley and Joseph Mozinski were part of this mysterious group, but they had defected along with a number of other former agents, including Joseph's brother. They had taken with them documents that they were now using to blackmail the group. Some blackmail money had been paid to the traitors, but the Red Diamond had decided enough was enough. All the members pulled a card out of a deck, and 3X had drawn the King of Diamonds, marking him as the person who needed to take out the traitors and recover the documents. The letter ended with a statement that the last document had been returned on June 19th at 9 p.m. His mission had ended and there was no further cause for worry. It was the last confirmed correspondence from 3X. During this time, the police had not been idle. After the second crime, 3X had claimed that he would take the life of 14 other people if the documents were not handed over. Hundreds of undercover officers were on patrol searching for the criminal. The police believed he would strike on the day of Nick's funeral, as Nick had been attacked on the day of Joseph's funeral. 200 officers were uncovered that night, hoping the mysterious figure would approach one of them, but he never showed up. Even after the final letter, one of the largest investigations in New York's history continued. Years later, one man claimed to be the criminal responsible, but his story didn't line up, and he was dismissed and placed in a mental health hospital. Other letters supposedly from 3X were also sent, but these were determined to be hoaxes. When 3X signed his name, he wrote the letter X as a letter V sitting on top of another inverted letter V, rather than just two lines crossing one another. The hoaxes didn't match this style and also got the details of the crime wrong. The truth about 3X and why he took the lives of two apparently ordinary men remains a mystery. Number 2. Karen Silkwood had dreamed of becoming a scientist growing up. That dream seemed to have been realized when she started working as a lab technician at a plant that produced pellets for nuclear power plants. But that dream turned into a nightmare of safety violations that would likely have taken her life if a mysterious car crash hadn't done it first. The incident was officially ruled an accident, but friends, family, and activists believed something more sinister had happened. Karen started working at the Kerr-McGee plant in Oklahoma City in 1972. Before that, she'd been living in Texas with her husband and their 3 children. Karen had studied medical technology at Lamar University, but dropped out to become a housewife. When the couple's marriage of 7 years broke down, Karen moved to Oklahoma for a fresh start. At first, things seemed to be going well at Kerr-McGee, but Karen soon caught on to the safety violations that were going on. She was elected as a representative at the union and hoped to be able to address the safety concerns through official means. That unfortunately didn't happen. In 1974, Karen started to collect documents that she believed would highlight the case she was making. At the same time, she continued her normal work routine, but this would change on November 5th. Karen was working at a glove box. This is where radioactive material is kept within a secure, see-through box, and workers interact with it with gloves attached to the box. During a routine self-check, devices designed to detect alpha particles alerted Karen that her entire right arm was covered in radiation. It was roughly 400 times the limit for plutonium contamination. She thoroughly decontaminated, but had to submit samples to be tested over the following days. Those samples showed high levels of radiation. At first, it was thought that there must have been some tear in the glove, and that Karen had been contaminated at the glove box. There was plutonium found on the inside of the glove, the part that would have been directly touching her hand, but no tear. The contamination had come from elsewhere. After Karen tested positive for radiation contamination the next 2 days, her home was tested. She shared her home with the boyfriend and another worker at the facility. Teams sent to examine the house found plutonium traces everywhere. It was particularly significant in the bathroom and kitchen. There were even traces on a sandwich found in the refrigerator. Karen and her housemates were taken to Los Alamos National Laboratory for further testing. By November 12th, Karen had been barred from the plutonium processing areas. The next day, she would lose her life. On November 13th, Karen attended a union meeting at a cafe. She was carrying with her a manila folder of documents that she planned to take with her to a meeting with the journalist. This was all the evidence she needed for the New York Times journalist to create a big expose on the company. She got into her Honda Civic and began the 30-mile journey from the cafe to Oklahoma City. About 5 minutes into the journey, while traveling on State Highway 74, Karen veered off the road and hit a culvert. She passed away before emergency services arrived. One first responder recalled seeing papers scattered around Karen's car. He'd collected them and put them on the back seat. Karen's car was towed from the site, though there was some confusion in that. The police had initially called their tow truck, only to send him back, but the car was eventually pulled from the wreck site and secured. When Karen's family went to recover the car, the documents were nowhere to be found. After this, they began to grow suspicious about the official story. Before the incident, Karen had been prescribed some sleeping tablets by her doctor. A report found traces of the sleeping tablets in her system, as well as a small amount of alcohol. But there was debate over whether this would have been enough for her to fall asleep at the wheel. While many experts claimed it wasn't, and she actually would have had a resistance to the pills by that point, the police decided that it was enough. Karen had simply fallen asleep behind the wheel 5 minutes into her journey and veered off the road. Karen's family hired a private investigator, A.O. Pipkin. Pipkin had previously worked as a police officer and had a so-called passion for accident reconstruction. He noted a dent at the rear of Karen's car, which wouldn't have come from the accident itself if it really was a one-car crash. He also found skid marks which indicated Karen had tried to get back onto the road. It looked as if someone had hit her from behind, sending her off the road and into the culvert. The official reports dismissed the claim. Kerr-McGee had been working against Karen during her campaigns for the union. When the high contamination levels were detected, lawyers at the company put forward the idea that Karen had been deliberately contaminating herself to make the company look bad. Apparently, she had become so scared at the possibility that she would get ill due to accidental contamination that she had deliberately digested plutonium to hurt the company. During her autopsy, plutonium traces were found in her lungs and in her digestive tract. She had ingested and breathed in the radioactive material, but whether she did this deliberately or this was simply a consequence of working at the facility couldn't be determined. One thing was for certain. A doctor claimed that given the amount of material she had ingested, there was no way she would have avoided cancer. Karen's family took out a civil suit against the company. The case focused only on unsafe working conditions at the facility, and not about Karen's mysterious accident. Kerr-McGee lawyers tried to argue that Karen had been taking small amounts of plutonium home to contaminate her house and body. But even if that was the case, that showed that the high levels of security that should have been present obviously weren't. Karen's family won the suit, but it did nothing to explain their loved one's mysterious passing. The folder of documents Karen allegedly had with her in the car that day has never been found. Some have speculated that the situation at Kerr-McGee went beyond simple health and safety violations. It was later discovered that large amounts of plutonium had gone missing from the facility. They speculated that a smuggling operation had been working at Kerr-McGee, and Karen had uncovered evidence of this. She may not have even known it at the time, but the smugglers had decided to try to scare Karen into silence by contaminating her home. When that didn't work, they drove her off the road. Others put the blame firmly on Kerr-McGee. Just 14 months after Karen passed away, the factory was shut down. The company that bought its pallets had found that the product was substandard and decided not to renew its contract with Kerr-McGee. This wasn't proof of any of the claims made by Karen and other activists working at the facility, but it did fit in with some of the accusations. For example, they claimed there were cracks in some of the fuel rods that were being covered up by the company. Karen Silkwood has become a hero for some, and a film was even made about the strange case in 1983. Others are less certain and think it could have been a well-timed tragic accident. So far, nothing has been proven, and her accident remains a strange mystery. Number 1. The Scandinavian Star had only been working its new route for less than a week when a tragic fire occurred in April of 1990. More than 150 people lost their lives, and the cause of the fire, or fires, has never been explained. For years, VR Dano lines have been operating services between Norway and Denmark. In March of 1990, they were in need of a new vessel for the journey and purchased the Scandinavian Star from a cruise ship company operating in the Caribbean. The company wanted to get the Scandinavian Star ready for service as quickly as possible. Within weeks, it had been transformed from a casino cruise ship to a normal passenger ship. That also meant transforming the crew. The crew was a mixture of those who had come with the ship, those who had previously worked the route for VR Dano, and new recruits mostly from the Portuguese hospitality sector. It led to some communication problems, as some of the staff didn't speak Danish or Norwegian, but it didn't concern operators too much. On April 1st, less than a month after the company had gotten the ship, it set sail on its first Scandinavian voyage. The VR Dano hadn't even bothered to change the livery on the outside of the ship yet, and it still looked like it belonged to the Caribbean Cruise Company. The Scandinavian Star made the trip between Denmark and Norway a few times without issue. Then the trip on April 6th began. The ship was supposed to leave Oslo's ferry terminal at 7 p.m., but loading delays pushed the departure time back to 9:15. Once they finally left the dock, it should have taken about 13 hours to get to Frederikshavn. During that time, the 395 passengers had access to a lounge, restaurant, shops, and a disco. Many wouldn't have spent long here though before retiring to their cabins on decks 4 and 5. Between 1:45 a.m. and 2 a.m., a small fire was discovered on deck 4. Apparently, a pile of bedclothes outside a cabin had been set alight. It was quickly extinguished and the crew believed they had avoided a disaster. Not long after, another fire was set. this time on Deck 3. Deck 3 also had passenger cabins, but none were being used at the time. The fire went unnoticed for a while, allowing it to grow. By the time it was discovered, the crew were unable to put it out. At 2:24, a mayday message was sent out. At 3:20, the captain gave orders to abandon the ship. Initially, it was believed that almost everyone had escaped. Just before the captain himself abandoned the ship, he sent a radio message saying that he believed everyone had gotten out. Sadly, that wasn't the case. About a third of the passengers and 2 crew members had passed away. It's believed that all the victims lost their lives before 2:45 a.m., before the order to abandon ship was ever even made. The total victim count for the tragedy was 158, most of them from Norway. Once the ship was brought back to a dock, the first of the investigations into the fires began. There were many reasons why the fire was so devastating, and not all of them were sinister. The fact that there had been such a rush to get the ship in service meant that a lot of things had been missed. 3 alarm bells were missing, which meant that the sound of the fire alarm would only have been loud enough to wake people in about a third of the cabins. Once they were awake, getting out was also difficult. There were no emergency notices in any Scandinavian languages, and the crew hadn't been properly trained in what to do in an emergency. The layout of the ship meant that fire escapes weren't obvious. Many people lost their lives because the exit on Deck 5 wasn't at the end of the corridor, but at the outboard bulkhead. The ship was also perfect for helping the fire spread. It was about 20 years old by this point. It had been up to standards when it was first launched in the 70s, but it hadn't been inspected since. The walls were made of fireproof asbestos boarding, but they were covered in a plastic decorative sheet. That plastic helped the fire spread and produced toxic fumes. There was also the fact that many fire doors weren't closed. Some had allegedly been deliberately propped open. That meant the fire couldn't be contained in one section. The doors being propped open wouldn't necessarily mean someone wanted the fire to spread, though. It could have been down to a lack of training and not understanding the importance of keeping these doors shut. While this helped explain why the fires were so devastating, it didn't explain how they started. Any thought that this might have been a tragic accident disappeared quickly. It seemed as if the blazes had been deliberately set. Attention fell on a lorry driver named Erik Mork Andersen. Erik had 3 convictions for arson, and he had been on board during the incident, but he passed away early on. Opinions were divided over whether Erik was actually responsible for the incident. It was possible he had started the fire only to discover that he couldn't escape, but there was no actual evidence for this, and some thought that he was an easy scapegoat for the real criminal. Multiple investigations have taken place, and in 2014, Erik was cleared of any wrongdoing, but the real culprit was never identified. Later investigations made some startling discoveries. Some experts believed there had actually been 4 fires set on the ship. In 2016, a Danish ship inspector placed the blame on crew members of the Scandinavian Star. He alleged that it was sabotage. The company that owned the ship had received $14 million in compensation, but was this really enough to self-sabotage? This inspector wasn't alone in his suspicions. According to some, a handful of crew members had deliberately helped the fire or stopped the efforts that were being made to put it out. In 2021, the Danish government announced that they would reopen the investigation into the strange mystery. Hopefully, this investigation will finally lead to answers for the victims and their families. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.